Can you tell us a little about your book?
Well, it's really a book about the discovery that a priest is a child sex offender, a child molester, and it's essentially it's really a crime novel, a mystery novel, because the book begins with a couple of people finding his body in the rectory. He's been murdered, and as you peel back into that story, you discover that this priest, who was very popular in his parish and great charisma and so forth, has had a history of abusing children, and that revelation startles both the pastor of the parish, where this guy is the assistant pastor, and he brings in his nephew, who's the narrator of the story and who works for the archdiocese or the diocese. Although he's not a priest or anything, he's a married man, and he's a PR director for the diocese. And anyway, it's the revelations that come about with discovering that this man was not who people thought he was. He was not trustworthy, and he wasn't a good shepherd of the flock. And it's basically a cover-up dealing with the bishop and the hierarchy's attempt at stopping any information and getting out into the public, because that would be a huge embarrassment and horrible in terms of the reputation of the church. And it takes place in the 1980s, and the reason why I did that, it was one of the first cases in my fictional world that the diocese has to contend with. And so when we read headlines today in 2018, and we see that there have been 40 or 50 or 60 years of abuse by certain priests or in certain dioceses, and almost universally across the country, a troubling statistic, a troubling story. I wanted to show how this begins and how the cover-up has pretty much how it works. And that's where I started the book. I was really unfamiliar with the whole subject, even though I grew up Catholic. I went to 14 years of Catholic schools, and I never encountered that to speak of. And of course, I grew up in the 50s and early 60s. And so the revelations that began to come forth were really disturbing to me. And the first book I read in 1992 now by Jason Berry, called Lead Us Not Into Temptation, opened my eyes to the fact that, wow, this was one particular case in Southwest Louisiana. But I actually knew the seminary where this guy went to school, and he was there about the same time I was. Not in the seminary, but in a Catholic high school next door to the seminary. And I just thought, wow, this hits close to home. It opened my eyes, and then he also said, and this is not unusual. There are other cases. Well, over the next 20 years, we discovered there are many, many cases. The scale is unbelievable. And I just began as a novelist in my head to take notes and think about this book. And it took a long time to finally get to writing it, but I knew I wanted to understand my characters and wanted to understand the situation. And so I did a lot of research and talking to people to sort of find out how my own book would unfold.
Your novel is obviously written by someone deeply familiar with the Catholic faith, which you've touched on briefly. Can you tell us a little bit more about your Catholic upbringing? Sure.
I went to 3 different Catholic schools from grade 1 to grade 12. In Texas City, Texas, where I'm from, the Catholic school, which was small, went from grades 1 to 8, and then some of us decided, well, we want to continue with the Catholic school education, so I went to 1 year in Galveston, which is about 10 miles away and across a causeway. So there was a bus that would come pick up those on the mainland who were interested in going to the school. And in those days, and probably still, maybe still, the boys and girls were separated. So there was an all-boys school and 2 all-girls schools. And the 2 girls' schools were Dominican and Ursuline. And the boys' school at that point was called Kerwin High. And I went there, and a year there. And I had never been taught I'd always been taught by nuns. So this was my first introduction to Christian Brothers, who are a teaching order of the church. And I thought they were great. They were funny. They were irreverent. They were charismatic. And I thought, this is really amazing. So then I went to a Christian Brothers high school in Lafayette, Louisiana, where it was a high school, not a seminary, but everyone there was thinking about becoming a Christian brother or something else. So I was deeply enmeshed in my family's Catholic. And so, my schoolmates, all growing up, most of them or half of them were Catholic, and we all played baseball and football together, and all that. Went to dances with the girls and so forth. I mean, it wasn't as if it was exclusively Catholic, because the city is not. It's mostly a Protestant city. As most of Texas, I think, might be. But we were, we had this little enclave. There were about 35 kids in my class. And so that was my upbringing. And I was an altar boy, when the Mass was in Latin. So I had to learn all that Latin. And then it transformed later into English. So I know a lot, and I've studied an enormous amount of Catholic theology because of that upbringing, and also a little bit in college. And I'm really familiar with certainly the Gospels and the New Testament, and quite a bit of the Old Testament, though I can't say I've read it all. So all of my friends and myself, we were just really deeply involved in the church, and good. I was a good Catholic schoolboy, and so that's basically my upbringing there. As I mentioned, I never saw or was approached myself in terms of a priest or a brother coming on to me or anything like that, and I didn't know anybody who did, although there may have been that case. But I think in the 50s and 60s these things were rare. There were rotten apples, but it wasn't systemic, and it didn't become the large scale that it's become in recent years, recent decades.
Well, I know you've touched on this a little bit already, but the headlines today are so focused on the sexual abuse of Catholic school children by clergymen. Were you aware of it taking place? Do you have any thoughts or insight on what's contributed to this?
Yeah, I mean, this is a major point in the book, and that is, what was the sea change that went from what I experienced in the 50s and early 60s as a schoolboy and an altar boy, and there was never any talk of that sort of thing. And I didn't know anybody, and I still don't. I've been in touch with a lot of my friends for a long time, and none of them have talked about being abused or approached in any way. And then suddenly something happened in the church that opened the door to this kind of culture. And I would say that two things. I would say that because of celibacy, in the late 60s there was an exodus of priests and nuns out of and brothers out of their service, and they left the priesthood, they left the church. Well, not necessarily the church. And some of them got married. I know 3 couples who are in their 70s now who were a priest and a nun. And what happened was, those folks were family oriented. They wanted to get married, and they wanted to have children, and that's not allowed in the priesthood, in the church. And it's really probably the crux of the whole situation, of the whole thing there. And that is, the Catholic Church doesn't have a family culture, especially on a diocesan level. It's run by bachelors. It's run by good old boys. The Vatican and its hierarchy, and there are a million different sort of committees, the way there are in Congress that you don't even know about. There's all these committees studying this and that and the other, and they're all men. There are no women in the upper echelons of the hierarchy. There are secretaries and that sort of thing, but that's it. So it's a good old boy network that's been run that way for centuries. And so these guys are confirmed bachelors. I remember how awkward the brothers who taught us in high school, how awkward they were with women. And they just don't know that. They don't know that amazing part of our lives and that amazing part of the world. And as bachelors, they stick together. And so when there was this exodus and everyone left who was going to get married and that sort of thing, well, it just left the hardened and confirmed male camaraderie. It left it in place, and it's sad, but in a lot of ways, these are just bros taking care of their own. They don't approve of it, but they don't want and they know this or that, but they don't want those folks to be taken off to prison. They think they can fix them. The good priests, they think they can cure them. They think they can counsel them. We're talking about pedophiles, but they really don't know enough about it, and they certainly don't know about recidivism. And so they end up sheltering, even though they're appalled by the same things we are, end up sheltering a group. And in the bishop's cases, they send them off to different dioceses, hoping that they will change. And there are drugs now that help with that also, to help them with their urges and that sort of thing. But it has become a culture, I think, primarily because it's not a family culture, and more importantly, because there are no women in the church. Now, if you know women, if you know your mothers, and all the mothers that we know, including my wife and all the great mothers I know, they have a nose for pedophiles. They have a nose for creeps. They have this, I don't care if you call it, as Sister Colleen in the book says, I don't care if you call it female intuition. I don't care what it is. I know when somebody's off and a creep. And I can, in my personal life, my wife and I actually got a bad vibe about a guy. And he wasn't a priest or anything like that. He was a young guy. And it turns out he ended up going to prison because of his strange obsessions. But women and mothers especially know when there's somebody creeping around their children that's there's something off there, and they know. And if, as Sister Colleen says in the book, if women were allowed to be priests, if women were allowed to marry priests, and there was a family culture in these rectories where all these guys live, the mothers, the women, they wouldn't have put up with this, and they certainly would have exposed it much sooner. So basically, it's just a bunch of good old boys, and they're basically protecting their own. By the way, it happens in college football as well. When you think about some of the major cases where a pedophile was at work as an assistant coach or something like that, and the head coach and the athletics director just ignored it, brushed it under the rug, didn't really want to believe it, didn't really want to believe that was happening, and it's the same thing. It's as I say, bros protecting bros, and it's really led to a lot of bad things.
At the end of the novel, when Father Ted realizes that Peter is writing a book about the case, he asks him to make sure he explains the difference between him and Father Landry, who, the pedophile.
Yeah.
What he's saying is there's no connection between being gay and being a predator of underage boys. And obviously that's a very delicate subject. So would you share your thoughts?
Sure. There's absolutely no connection between homosexuality and pedophilia, even if it's a pedophile who's preying on boys. The vast majority of heterosexuals and homosexuals are balanced and mature, and they understand the criminality of having sex with underage boys or girls, right? So in the book, Father Ted discusses with his nephew for the very first time that Ted has a gay orientation, although he's celibate and he's never done anything that would break his vow of celibacy. He understands that world. And in many cases, when I've done a lot of research and reading and so forth, in many cases, even priests who prey on boys don't consider themselves gay. They consider that as, like the Greeks did, as a kind of side thing to their marriage or to their own lives. They really don't consider themselves gay. So this is not about being gay, and a lot of folks may construe that problem in that way. Oh, it's a gay culture. No, it's a pedophile culture. And people who prey on children, and by the way, in the real world, the vast majority of predators are preying on young girls rather than boys. In the church, it seems to be mostly boys. But that's what Father Ted wanted Peter to say in the book and explain, and that there was such a huge difference between him, who has nothing but respect for children and nurtured them, taught them, brought them along, and somebody who's a wolf preying on these children. There's just a world of difference. And I want to say that one of the guys that was most influential in reading my book and helping me with several issues like this is a gay man, and he's a professor, and he's counseled victims of sexual abuse by clergymen, counseled them. He's actually sat for depositions in their favor and in court trials, and he knows this field very well. He knows those young men and who are preyed upon, and he was very useful, and he was very happy that I was making that distinction, and he in numerous places in the book was able to say, you don't quite have this right here. And so I benefited from his great input, his advice.
Well, Could you tell us a little bit more about the research that you did? Just understanding all of the issues that arise.
So once this issue raised its head to this old Catholic boy in about 1992, when I read Jason Berry's book, I started then noticing. You began noticing in books and articles and documentary films all through the 90s and up until now. And there's a great deal of literature. And then also the victims started coming forth and creating their own victim support groups. And those are like SNAP and various groups like that, Bishop's Accountability and all those, where they began to speak out and say, I was abused as a kid and this needs to stop, and we need to find, if the pedophile is still alive, we need a moment of reckoning here. And so once I began to read all the stories of victims using the social media of, it's all on the internet, and talking with some counselors of victims, and just reading a whole lot, the story began to take place in my head. And eventually, it took a while. It took a while for me to, sort of get the outline of what I had in my head, and then to start exploring the story. But yeah, I mean, I still, any kind of article right now that's about the Pope or a cardinal or a bishop, having some problem as a result of one of the priests under their wing, doing something terrible. I follow those stories, and I think there's a lot of finger pointing right now in the church hierarchy, and the Pope is a little bit. I don't think he's fully 100% up on his game, but I think his heart's in the right place, and he's trying. He's learning, and there are some bad players, and they're all pointing at each other like, oh no, you should have taken care of this. Why were these offenses happening under when you were a bishop in your diocese and that sort of thing? But the point is, all of this needs to be opened up. The files need to be opened up. Those who committed crimes, if they're still within that range, to be prosecuted, and the church needs to apologize. These individuals need to apologize, and I think we're halfway there, but there needs to be a lot more accountability, and also basically just public penance, saying, I am sorry, I am deeply sorry that this happened, or it happened under my watch.
So how would you say this book is different from the movie Spotlight, which tackles the same subject? So
Spotlight is really kind of all the president's men with the Catholic Church and pedophiles, priest pedophiles. It's basically focused on the journalists and their story and how they uncovered it and what journalists do and the difficulties they had. And I think it was good. And but it was, outsiders trying to crack that mighty fortress that is the Catholic hierarchy, and they it's a great movie in the sense that they were going at it as Woodward and Bernstein did with Watergate. I was left a little cold by the film because I didn't think the one or two victims they show in the film are kind of strange and a little bit offbeat, and that's couldn't be farther from the truth. There are all sorts of incredibly all-American boys and mainstream people who that happened to. So what I do it's different. They're outsiders looking in. I know a whole lot about the church and how this works, and so I wanted to show how a cover-up works, how it works from the inside, from the first meetings you have around a table, with the bishop or not, the vicar general who's second in command, and lawyers and staff members and priests and so forth, to sort of how are we going to cover this up. And so I wanted to explore that part of it to show how it works. I mean, how the cover-up works. So I have a kind of insider's view here, and that was my approach.
Reading about this rather dark corner of the Catholic Church is not a fun or a light read. Right. How do you attract readers to a grim subject like this? Why should they pick it up?
Yeah. I think people are curious about this subject, and it doesn't matter whether you're Catholic or not. I think the vast majority of people who read these stories are puzzled. It's like, how does this happen? How could this have happened? Where were the protectors? Where were the guardians of these children? How could this go on? In some cases in a rectory where the other priests who lived there didn't know anything about it. How could that possibly be? So I think people are curious about how a cover-up works, and that's what I wanted to show them. It's a story about a couple of good men, I think, who get caught up in the cover-up, and they realize their mistake, and they try to right it. And that's the story, really. And they're up against the formidable church hierarchy, and and the church hierarchy has really good lawyers, and that's that's the struggle in the book. It's I hope revelatory. Okay, so if you're wondering why is this happening with the church on this scale? Why is it so large? Well, I tried to take on the very first case in the 1980s in New Orleans, and show how it went down.